Hello, and good evening, everyone. My name is Nicole Lund, and I'm here to discuss mass incarceration with you tonight. Thank you all for being here. The topic of incarceration is so shameful and stigmatizing. This conversation would have been possible even 10 years ago. So I'm deeply appreciative that you all showed up here tonight. I'll start with a brief overview of what incarceration in America looks like today, including some numbers and statistics, followed by a short history lesson explaining how we arrived here. Then I will share a little bit about myself and why I'm passionate about this work. We will close with a call to action and then open things up for questions. It is my hope that by the end of this conversation, you will see the importance of addressing this very significant issue in our society. Quick disclaimer, this topic can be heavy and bring up strong emotions for people, so I encourage you all to take care of yourself during this conversation and afterwards, and practice good self-care. The first thing to know about this situation is that there are more than 2.3 million people locked up in our country's prisons and jails. The United States is ranked #1 in the world in terms of incarceration. The United States has only 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. As you can see from this chart detailing the rate of incarceration, the United States locks up 655 people per 100,000. Our closest competitors for the title of #1 are El Salvador, Rwanda, and Russia, which are not countries that we think of as championing democracy or human rights. The difference between our country and other countries becomes even more stark when we look at our rates of incarceration compared to other similarly developed countries. When you look at the United Kingdom, for example, our incarceration system stemmed from the system that they have in England, but we had very divergent outcomes. And that number of 2.3 million, it only represents the people inside. Because we're talking about humans, we are not talking about a problem that exists in a bubble. The truth is, if you are the family member or loved one of somebody who's incarcerated, you are serving that sentence with them. And the numbers are staggering. Mass incarceration is no longer something that impacts a small portion of our society. According to a research study out of Cornell University published in 2019, nearly 50% of adults have had an immediate family member incarcerated. When we expand the criteria from immediate family member to extended family, 64% of adults in America have had a loved one incarcerated. It is estimated that 6.5 million families are directly impacted by the prison system. With those kinds of numbers, it's easy to imagine the impact on the family system. 1 in 4 adults have had a sibling incarcerated. 1 in 5 adults have had a parent incarcerated. 1 in 7 have had a spouse or co-parent incarcerated. And 1 in 8 have had a child incarcerated. And the issue of mass incarceration does not impact all communities equally. When we look at the lifetime likelihood of whether or not a person will be imprisoned, race and gender are 2 primary categories that separate us. In terms of all men, 1 in 9 have a chance of being incarcerated. Another aspect to take into consideration is economic status. When we look at class and household income, we see the devastating impact of poverty and how it is tangled up with the criminal justice system involvement. When talking to families who have had loved ones incarcerated, we find that 53% of families whose yearly household income is $24,000 or less have had a loved one locked up, while families who make over $100,000 per year only show at 33%. So your chances of being incarcerated go up as your income declines. And contrary to what most Americans believe, many incarcerated people will die in prison. 1 in 7 are serving a life sentence, many without the possibility for parole. Life without parole, or LWOP, was introduced in the 1970s as a humane alternative to the death penalty. But the men and women serving that sentence don't see it that way. They call it the walking death or death by incarceration. It is still a form of capital punishment, just without an end date. And Maine has incredibly harsh sentencing and still does not have parole for any of its incarcerated residents. Although there is a parole board in place for inmates transferred from other states serving their sentences in Maine. So I want to reiterate that inmates who are sent to Maine from other states often have parole as part of their sentence. Maine employs a parole board to oversee these out-of-staters, but not one Maine resident currently incarcerated is offered parole. Also, Maine is the only state to still not have public defendants. The indigent legal services in the state are terrible and nearly non-existent. So you have a situation where prosecutors have all the power, defendants are cripplingly underrepresented, and there is no chance for parole. And this is why those charged will often plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit in hopes of leniency instead of a life sentence. Often leniency comes in the form of a 50, 60-year sentence, which is essentially the same as life without parole. The cost of locking people up has continued to rise since the 80s. In 2018, it reached $60.9 billion, and it continues to climb. As of last year, it reached more than $84 billion. It cost taxpayers in Maine $78,000 to incarcerate one person for 1 year. If we estimate somebody going into prison at the age of 20, serving a life sentence until they die at age 70, we've just spent $3.9 million on that one person. In comparison, Maine spent around $12,000 per student in the public education system. And when we're talking about crime prevention, education, and high school education, everything that happens for kids during that time in their lives is really where it's at. And I can't help but feel like we're spending our money on the wrong end of this problem. So now that we've had an overview of the current situation, let's zoom out and do a quick review of how we got here. So it's a bit of a history lesson, but we'll keep it brief. Mass incarceration is 40 years in the making. So let's go back to the 1950s to the 1960s, when sweeping legislation was passed to close long-term psychiatric hospitals. And in some ways, this was a positive because some of those facilities had reached population levels of small cities, and there were many documented human rights violations. The problem was the follow-up legislation that was supposed to designate funding for communities' resources, like housing and other outpatient services, never occurred at the level it was needed. Homelessness among the mentally ill surged, leaving them vulnerable to incarceration. Then in the 1960s to the 1970s, rates of crime and violence began to rise all over the country. This is the first time we see criminal justice become a wedged political issue. And what I mean by that, it was the first time that politicians started to use criminal justice as a platform to get elected. Then President Nixon began the war on drugs in 1971. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan turbocharged that war on drugs. And for any of you who may remember the crack epidemic, sentencing surrounding this issue is a glaring example of classism present in our criminal justice system. Possession, trafficking, and using powdered cocaine carried significantly lower sentences than its less pure, cheaper counterpart, crack, which carried heavy mandatory minimums. Then in the 1990s, there was a crisis of youth violence in our country, specifically in our cities, including Boston. The number of adolescents committing violent crimes reached peak levels. Criminologists at the time sparked mass panic by proposing the super predator theory. This theory predicted there would be an explosion of teenage super predators who are not only violent but evil and malicious, and this never came to fruition. The theory was baseless and has been debunked, but research shows the myth of the super predator is still very much present in the American psyche. So this era of mandatory minimum drug sentencing, tough on crime policies, and truth in sentencing has led to the mass incarceration of youth, citizens with mental health illnesses, and people suffering from drug addiction. And we have seen a 500% increase in the prison population in the past 40 years, which looks like this. Ultimately, mass incarceration was the result of the criminalization of social and public health problems, combined with an overreaction to misplaced fears of violence. Our politicians have had the tendency to act swiftly, based on emotions, making it very easy to lock people up. Very little has happened to undo these policies, and there has been outright refusal by government officials to decarcerate the population inside. And in case you're wondering, research has shown little to no correlation between locking people up and rates of violence going down. Drugs are still a defining characteristic of the prison system, and much of the crimes that are classified as violent are primarily drug-related. Incarceration is not a deterrent to future violent crimes. In order for something to be a deterrent, a person needs to know such a punishment exists. They need to be able to rationally stop and think clearly that if they do this thing, then this punishment might happen. Anyone who is suffering from substance use disorder, about to commit an act of violence, is not thinking clearly. And given that young people are generally the ones to commit acts of violence, they are also the least likely to be aware of the sentencing in their state. And just like people age out of crime, people are much more likely to get help and seek recovery resources for substance abuse issues as they get older. So I became interested in the subject of mass incarceration because of my own lived experience with the criminal justice system. And like the vast majority of people incarcerated, I've been both victim and perpetrator. As a result of poor coping skills, I used substances to deal with long-term abuse and trauma I had experienced. By the age of 19, I was a heroin addict living on the streets of Boston when I was abducted by a man who was recently released from Walpole. After I escaped, my drug use amped up tenfold, and I eventually found myself in front of a judge facing 15 years. The judge offered me leniency. Instead of sending me to prison, he offered me probation with a contingency. I had to comply with a 2-year outpatient drug rehabilitation program, suspending the remainder of my sentence. So basically, he sentenced me to therapy instead of prison. I am acutely aware of how lucky I am. And unfortunately, a lot of people I knew at the time were not so lucky. Several of my friends died on the streets, and several more died while incarcerated for crimes that I was shown leniency for. And I tell you all of this because I want you to understand that the issue of incarceration is not an academic one, it is a human one. And the relationship between victims and perpetrators is not binary, it is a loop. I may have started out a victim, but I quickly became a criminal, and I was further victimized, and I sunk deeper into criminality. The cycle wasn't broken for me until someone intervened with real restorative justice solutions. I was given the opportunity to address the hurt I was experiencing and behavioral therapies to continue my life in the community with support. Hurt people, and we need to address and heal that hurt that people are experiencing in order to prevent crime. Putting people in cages doesn't fix the root of the problem, and it doesn't heal our communities. So in conclusion, I would like to propose a call to action, and you can choose your own adventure on this. If you are interested in learning more, there are 1 million books on the subject, with more being published every day. And these are 3 excellent reads: Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, The Meaning of Life, The Case for Abolishing Life Sentences, Until We Reckon, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair. Or if reading isn't your thing, there are plenty of documentaries. There's 13th, which is available on YouTube as well as Netflix. Jacinta, which tracks the experiences of Lewiston, Auburn residents and does an excellent job illustrating the generational nature of incarceration and substance abuse. And the Prison in 12 Landscapes, which shows how geography plays a part in how the prison industrial complex has been purposefully designed in this country. There are also countless podcasts, articles, and other online resources as well. And another thing I would urge everyone to do is to get involved directly, engage with people who have been system impacted, hear their stories, understand their lived experiences, and the humanity of this issue, and do something. I was a volunteer art teacher at the Maine State Prison, and I was blown away, not only by the skill of art created by the residents, but the vulnerability they were able to express through their art. I'm currently working as a story collector, collecting and archiving stories from system-impacted people for the Maine Historical Archives through the Freedom and Captivity Project. And not just the stories of those incarcerated, but their children, parents, volunteers, and correctional officers, in the hopes of getting a holistic view of incarceration as a whole and how it affects all the people in our communities. Recently, my dear friend Buddy Beeler, who is currently incarcerated, and I published a cookbook of prison recipes and stories related to food from inside titled Stuff Behind Bars. And there are many ways to get involved and make a difference. Lastly, we need to work towards ending life sentences. In order to end mass incarceration, it is not enough to stop the flow into the system. We must also decarcerate the current population. The Sentencing Project has a campaign to end life imprisonment, and I believe you were all handed flyers, so there's a QR code on there that you can scan, and it'll bring you to their website, so you can learn more about that. So thank you all for your time, and I'd like to open it up for discussion and questions and answers. Oh, thank you. Thanks. Well, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I could share it. And there's, like I said, the flyers too have QR codes that bring to a bunch of the organizations and things that we talked about in it for more information. Yeah, and I'd be happy to talk to them afterwards if I know I wanted to put together like a book list, but I just didn't have a chance to. So, but I'm happy to connect with anybody afterwards who's interested in volunteering or or just reading more about it. Yeah. Yes. I haven't. I've thought about it. At the time, I was young, and I felt like I got away with my life, and it was and I've thought about it, and the public defender too, and that was in Massachusetts, right, where they have excellent public defenders, and they have drug courts, and they have lots and lots of resources and a lot more money that they put into things like drug rehabilitation and those kinds of services. So, and I think about that with Maine a lot, where Maine has very, very limited resources in that capacity, and again, no public defenders, and Maine's been functioning on the system where they have like private attorneys that they pay significantly less than they would normally make in their own private practice, but they're willing to take on, these criminal defense cases. But it's not a good system, and it's a terrible system. And a lot of people sit in county just waiting for a lawyer and waiting to see a judge. And that whole time that they're sitting in county, they're not working, they're not with their families, they're not I mean, they're innocent until proven guilty. So they haven't even been found guilty of anything. They're just sitting in county jail waiting. And that's why by the time that they get in front of a judge, a lot of times they're like, yeah, whatever, I'm guilty. Just, please don't put me away for life. And they're sort of at the mercy of the judge. And other states just don't function like that. So it's a shame. Yeah, no, it's bad. The ACLU is actually suing the state of Maine because they're in violation of the Constitution, not having public defendants. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And there's next week I'm doing a presentation that's just about parole in Maine because it was abolished in 1976. And we've been trying to get it back since 1977, I think. Because it was kind of what happened. Like they abolished parole, people got real like tough on crime and like truth and sentencing and all this, and the prison population skyrocketed. And then there's no there isn't a lot of motivation for people to rehabilitate. And that's it. I mean, do we believe that people can change or not? Yeah, I changed. So I know people can. I've seen a lot of other people that have gone from, being criminals in the street to being, upstanding citizens and bringing a lot of good to the world. And so people are able to change. And it's a problem with not having any parole is we're basically saying that we don't believe in that. So you're asking me do I think that when other people are given the opportunity to have therapeutic services? I do. I think there's a lot to it, right? So it's kind of like you think about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like people need a safe place to live, and they need to know that they're going to have food and shelter and a safe place to sleep at night and clothes and things like that. And so I was very lucky that I was able to go back to my parents' house. My parents were there to kind of take me back. And it's one of the problems with so many of these people that are currently incarcerated is that even if they don't have life sentences, if they only have a couple of years, they don't have anywhere safe to go home to. They go right back to wherever they came from, which is often where they were getting into trouble. And so, and so that's how you get these when you talk about like rotating door prisons, that's what happens. Maine doesn't do a great job with reentry. So they kind of just, good luck when you get out of prison and, they don't have a job, they don't have a home to go back to and all these sorts of things. But whatever got them into prison, that's what they know. And so so I think that if, when people are given an opportunity to like develop new skills and work through their trauma and they're given therapeutic services and education, then people don't want to be in prison. They want to rehabilitate, and they don't feel good about the things that they did that got them sent there in the first place. Like nobody feels good about hurting other people or committing crimes or being like, nobody wakes up and says like, oh, I'm so glad I'm a drug addict. Nobody, like no one does that. So, I mean, it's like when you give people other options and ways out of that kind of a life, then they're very grateful and happy for it and are absolutely capable of change. Not really. No, no. And that's sort of it. I was, I was actually just talking to Jan about there's a gentleman who is at Baldock right now and he has his minimum. He's getting out in a year and he's so happy to be getting out, but he's terrified. And he's texting me and he's like, I don't know where I'm going to go. He's like, I don't know where I'm going to live when I get out of here. He's like, I don't want to go back to doing what I was doing. I don't want to go back to the people that I was with, but he's like, I don't know where else to go. And, they're not helping him. They're not helping him find a place to go. And so then it's, it's on kind of volunteers to try and do the Department of Corrections job for him and help these people find safe places to be when they get released. So, and there's no therapy services, and it's awful. They do check-ins. They do like kind of like wellness checks. So they'll check in on a guy, and if they know that it's somebody who's had a lot of problems with substance abuse, they'll check in on him like once a month and be like, hey, you're not doing drugs, right? All right, cool. And like give them a drug test, and you're not going to kill yourself, are you? Okay, great. And then that's their therapy. And then you'll come back in 30 days and do it again. So they're really not getting good treatment while they're there. Yes. It's a great question. I would love to know where the money is going. Yeah, I don't, I'm not really sure because they do always want more money and say they don't have the funds for this and that. But I don't know. I mean, we could decarcerate some people and that would save some money. But parole costs, I forget what it's like a fraction of what it costs to keep somebody incarcerated. I mean, it's $78,000 a year to keep one person incarcerated in Maine, and way less to give somebody parole and give them a chance to get out there and have a second chance. So yeah.
I'll just add to that the cost of keeping a child in prison at Long Creek is about $500,000 per person per year, $500,000 to $600,000. And the prisoners at Maine State Prison, the adult prisoners there, are doing a fundraiser to help pay for programming for Long Creek. So you have to wonder why prisoners have to do a fundraiser for kids who are at Long Creek when the state is paying over $500,000 per person per year. And then if a child goes to Long Creek rather than having restorative justice in the process for healing, they are 10 times more likely to go to prison than a child that goes through a restorative justice process. And if you're not familiar with restorative justice, the idea is that if you cause harm, you are responsible for repairing that harm, and that you need to work with the victim to make sure that they're healed from the process of whatever harm was caused. And we do that in a few places in Maine for youth, but we haven't gotten to the point where we're willing or ready to do that for adults. And I want to have you just think about Nicole, who it was a long time before I knew that she had actually been to court for drugs. She's just an average person who I would never think about her having a criminal history. And how many people that we meet every day are also in that situation where they have a criminal history, but you never know it because we do a really good job of hiding that. I often meet parents who come up to me and say, well, you probably know my son's in prison. I'm like, no, how would I know that, But for sure, looking at the statistics, we know that there are lots of people who are walking with us, talking with us, and part of our community who've experienced this. And they're pretty normal. So you can recover from criminal behavior and be a loving, giving participant in your community. And one more thing, because I can't stop talking. As someone who had a son who was incarcerated, it was my hope that when he was incarcerated, he would get the help he needed. That's just not what happens. I just want people to know that is not what happens. Prison is about punishment in Maine. It is not about rehabilitation. And we should never rejoice when someone goes to prison because it's really likely that it will have a huge negative impact on their lives. And the services that they need, if they're available at all, are available in their community. And and that's really the most healing spot that we could place someone, is in a community that can envelop them and help them so that they can heal.
No, you're not. No, please. Yeah, no, it's true. And I think that's it. Like we want people to be accountable for their actions. And I think sometimes we confuse accountability and punishment. And you're right. Yeah. Prison, it punishes people. It doesn't necessarily hold people accountable in the way that's would be healing to anybody who is involved. Mm-hmm. Who used to be a prosecutor and district attorney. Yeah, Jan, do you want to actually?
Yeah. So, just to identify myself, I work for Maine Prisoner Advocacy Coalition, and I have been involved with that organization over the course of my son's incarceration since 2012. And part of the work that we do is hopefully educating the legislature as well. As I think Nicole and I would like to be as gentle as possible in saying that we have not seen any movement on the part of the governor or the legislature in this area of reform. We've been talking about the indigent legal services in the state of Maine, and for the last at least 6 years, the Judiciary Committee in the legislature has called for huge increases in the budget for indigent legal services, but they haven't received it. And that's generally because the governor has opposed those budget initiatives. We know that Lawyer for the Day, which is the current situation, you go into court, a random lawyer appears, and they give you some initial information, and then you have to find somebody who will take your case. Often means that you don't have a lawyer who's trained in defense. And if you don't have training in defense, you're probably not going to be a great defense lawyer. So there are all kinds of different lawyers. Most people get their start in prosecution. There are lots of specialized tools that people who are defending lawyers need to learn. And in states that have defense lawyers for people who are indigent, they actually make you take low-level cases and courses until you build up enough experience so you can take violent crimes, or in the very highest level, murder charges. But you don't start out doing that. You have to start out defending people on a lower level until you really learn how to do defense. And you do that also by practicing with people with more experience than you. The way most of us learn is by hanging out with somebody who knows more than we do. So Maine has been way behind in that area. And not only that, but we have no way of overturning a guilty plea, even when we have evidence that it was a wrongful conviction. The average across the country is somewhere between 3% and 10% of everyone who's incarcerated is wrongfully convicted. There's never been an overturned conviction in the state of Maine, and there's almost no way to do it. You have 1 year from your sentencing to appeal.
or you have 1 year after some evidence comes up to actually use that evidence for an appeal. If you don't know about the evidence, that may not be a defense against you using that. And even when the evidence shows that someone else is more likely to have committed the crime, that doesn't mean you'll get a new trial. So not only do we not have incentive for rehabilitation, but we also have no way to actually overturn a wrongful conviction. We don't have a way of giving someone a second look that maybe their sentence was, they were over-sentenced for their crime. We have examples of situations where a crime was committed, no one died, but the individual got double life for the crime. They just happened to be black. And the judge just happened to say that before the case even went to court, the judge said they should throw the book at him. But there's no way that he can actually get that overturned at this point, although there are attorneys working on it at this moment. We have an aging population in Maine's prisons, and we have that aging population because we don't have parole. And when we did away with parole, we started lengthening people's sentences so that now almost every sentence is 20% longer than it was back in the 80s. So we have longer sentences, we have no way of shortening them, and we have people who are geriatric, people who have walkers, people who have dementia, people who have kidney dialysis, and who are pretty unlikely to be a threat to anyone in their community because they're in a wheelchair, but they will die in prison. I could go on for a long time. So thank you for listening. Any questions? Yeah, Carla. No, so there are no for-profit prisons in Maine. And in Maine, what is happening is the prison budget takes up a greater and greater percentage of our overall state budget every year. But it always gets funded. In the last budget cycle, the prison budget went up $40 million. Even though the population had gone down, the budget went up $40 million. When we asked for money for drug treatment, it didn't get funded. The prison budget is part of the governor's budget. The substance use disorder treatment budget comes out of appropriations, out of the small part of the money that the governor's budget left over for extras. So the things that really prevent people from going to prison and keep us all safer are, as Nicole said, education, surprise, surprise, healthcare. If you do not have health insurance, you are 7 times more likely to go to prison. Housing, nutrition. In the best situation, those things would be available to everyone. If they were available to everyone, we would see the numbers in prison go down dramatically. But what we see in our budget are those things go begging. They do get money, but they don't get the money that they need. And the prison always gets the money that it needs. So we're seeing more and more resources diverted to things like prisons and less money available for things like college education. We know that when I was in high school, many decades ago, that the state paid for 70% of a public college education. Today, it's less than 40%, closer to 30%. So that means that all of you who are going to college right now are seeing greater costs for you personally because the state isn't paying what they used to pay for education. And some of the reasons for that are we've increased police presence, we've increased the need for courts, we've increased the need for attorneys that the state needs to pay for, and we've grossly increased by 500% the number of people that are in prisons and jails. And we haven't even talked about jails, but over 40,000 people go in and out of Maine's jails every year. So, and our jails are asking for more money all the time also. So, Nicole, you had a question too? And this Nicole can probably answer it.
Oh, and I just wanted to say too, we were talking about like the for-profit prison, like Maine profits are not for-profit. However, there are many predatory private companies that profit off of prisons. So you have like Global Tellink, which provides the very, very expensive phone calls and texting services and the tablets that they have and all those kinds of things. At 10 cents a minute, 25 cents a text message. You know, like and then the O'Keefe Group, which does all the commissary food, which is insane. Because like looking at the, like the care packages and things that you can send into the guys in prison, it'll be like the same stuff you see at Walmart, but twice as expensive, and then you pay for shipping. So it's like the prison isn't for profit, but there are many, many companies that are profiting off of these guys being incarcerated. So I'm sorry, Nicole? Yes. Okay. So we're trying to get parole back. That's a big one. And also trying to expand the home confinement bill, because right now is a 30. You're eligible for home confinement. There's a bunch of stipulations, but you have to have less. Was it 30 months on your sentence? And so we're trying to get that expanded. So there's a lot of guys who were incarcerated like under the age of 25 and have life sentences, or like practically life sentences, like they have 50-year sentences kind of a thing. And they were, 21, 22 when they were sentenced. And other states like Massachusetts just did away with that. So if you were incarcerated under the age of 25, you can't be sentenced for more than 25 years in Massachusetts. There's a whole bunch of guys in Massachusetts right now who are getting lawyers and applying for, or applying for parole because they were, under that age when they were sentenced, and they've put in their 25 years and they can't be incarcerated anymore there. And so we're trying to get things like that passed in Maine. So yeah, the current, is it the bill that it's, so if you were sentenced under the age of 25, after 15 years served, you would be eligible for long-term home confinement. That is a bill that we're introducing in December. And so I think there's like 70 men right now, from what I understand, who would be eligible for that if it gets passed.
Nicole was talking a lot about reentry and the very meager reentry services that are provided by the Department of Corrections. We know that you can serve your time in solitary confinement and be released into the community directly from solitary confinement. That's should scare you a little bit, should scare you, because we know that solitary confinement has a crippling effect on people's mental health. So one of the bills that we're proposing would be that 6 months prior to release, you must have 6 hours out of your cell every day with programming. That is huge, because there is no specific programming for reentry. And that means that people who leave prison, especially if they've been there for a long time, are extremely vulnerable. They don't know how to use a phone. The internet is magic, and they're very vulnerable to scams of all kinds. They don't know how to find a job with a computer, and they don't know how to budget money because they haven't had any. So there are many services that we think that would be appropriate in the last 6 months to help people be successful on reentry. One of the most important is getting used to being around people again. So that is one of our bills. The other thing that is true in many states, Maine is one of them, there's no oversight for the Department of Corrections. We spend $500 million on corrections every biennial, and there's no oversight. We think that there should not be any department in the state of Maine that does not have oversight, and that having an ombudsman who can actually look into complaints would be good for the department, that they would actually gain valuable knowledge from that. We also think it would be good for all the people who are incarcerated and the people who work for the Department of Corrections if there was an ombudsman who could actually take complaints and independently investigate them. So that is another bill that we'll be submitting in this legislative session. So those are the primary bills, and there'll be lots of other ones that are more nuanced, but those are, there will obviously be something about indigent legal services as well, but that will probably be covered by the ACLU and not my organization. So, because it's nice to have attorneys in situations like that. So, any other questions?
Choosing to go to jail because it's a dead roof over their head. So kind of my one question is, how does that fit into kind of incarceration stuff that we're talking about now here in Maine, but also kind of the larger picture? And the other kind of thought I had was in Ohio, there's with the giant homeless crisis, there's a lot of youth under the age of 18, but also 25 and also 30 that have never been in a home. And so they're getting these giant sentences that you guys are talking about. And I wonder if there is an increase in younger people being incarcerated for longer periods of time, and that increase of just total people being incarcerated, how that might play into things. And also, we have more police officers saying how that plays into the way they react to the youth when they get called out. And there's several body cams of police officers just pepper spraying a bunch of kids in high school from right around the corner from them. And how that plays into things as well. Sorry, that was like
Yeah, thank you, Adin. And it's a very good question, because homelessness and incarceration are very closely linked. We know that in some places, as many as 50% of people who are released from prison become homeless upon release. And we also know that families who lose their breadwinner to incarceration often become homeless. My own family, when my father went to prison, became homeless because he was the sole breadwinner. So as Nicole very clearly pointed out, when an individual goes to prison, the whole family goes to prison. In other words, the consequences are felt by the entire family. So, and then the flip side of that is, well, no, I'll continue that line for a minute. So when you're released from prison in Maine, if you don't have any outstanding bills, you get $50. Picture that. You get $50. Enough maybe to get a meal for a couple of meals. You don't have a place to stay. You don't have transportation. You don't have a phone. How are you going to succeed? How are you even going to make it through the first day? So most people in that situation end up going to a homeless shelter. But some shelters won't accept people with criminal records. So then where do you go? On the flip side of that is, we are now criminalizing homelessness itself in the state of Maine. So we regularly have police patrols of homeless encampments. So, and as Nicole mentioned, we also no longer have long-term facilities for people with mental health conditions. So when I was growing up, if you walked down the street in Portland, you didn't see people with grocery carts and all of their belongings going up and down Congress Street, but you do now. So we have people who have a mental health diagnosis. They're probably having a hard time getting their medications or getting them on a regular basis. They're homeless. They're living in homeless encampments. The encampments are being policed and often destroyed with everything that they own gone. And people in those situations are forced to do whatever they can to survive. And that often means they may be jailed for petty crimes. So it's a really bad cycle. And as Adin mentioned, if we took care of that homeless situation, we would all be safer, including the people who are homeless. So it needs to be a priority. And we hope that it will be, but there's no guarantees in this political climate.
Were there any other questions? There are a lot of restorative justice efforts. They're outside the Department of Corrections. There's a lot of, kind of grassroots, volunteer organizations across the state. But yeah, I don't know how much the Department of Corrections is actually doing towards restorative justice. So
this is really another example of how complicated things can be. Most of the funding for restorative justice is actually part of the Department of Corrections budget. And the Department of Corrections has a policy of not funding restorative justice for adults or for violent crime. There is a group of restorative justice practitioners who were hoping to get a grant that they could use to do just that, to address, because most victims, whether it's of a violent crime or any other crime, want to be healed, not necessarily to hurt other people by incarcerating them. In fact, the majority don't see incarceration as a solution. But yet that is the solution that our government has opted for. So it's a very complicated picture when it comes to restorative justice in terms of how can we move forward if all the money is coming through the Department of Corrections and their policy is not to fund certain types of restorative justice. So those grants come through the Department of Corrections.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. Mm-hmm. So some of them are in general. Jacinta, that is Maine specific. Jacinta herself is from the Lewiston-Auburn area. And it's an excellent documentary. It talks about her and her mother who were actually incarcerated together at one point. No, but Jacinta's on Hulu, I believe. You could look it up. I can write it down for you too. Yeah. Yeah. I think so. I was just wondering that. Let me see. We go back. Oh, here we go. Yeah. Yeah. So there's many documentaries, but these three are excellent. This is why I would put them there. Yeah, Jacinta, it's interesting because I recognize people from working in the prisons who are in the documentary Jacinta. So. Whoops, I have to go back. How do I go back? No, you're fine. Yeah. Yeah, and there are many books.
My favorite of those three, Until
Yeah, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.